Let's talk about the rookie wide receivers that are fantasy football bargains in 2025. Heading into the NFL draft, there was a lot of conversation about the running back class, which we did discuss on the show earlier this week. But then we get into the wide receiver class and people talking about not as much on the high end. But I think some of the landing spots are intriguing. I do still think that there is some of the guys going in the early ranges and some of the guys I think going in the later rounds that are still intriguing profiles that we do want to make sure that we get on our fantasy rosters in 2025. Zachariason joins me again. As I mentioned, we did rookie running backs that are undervalued earlier this week. Make sure you do check that one out after you finish up here. But JJ, the wide receiver class as a whole, I'm going to go back 5 weeks, 6 weeks, whenever the NFL draft was. How are you feeling in general about the class as a talent group? And then as the dust has settled, how do you feel overall about landing spots and situations? Are you feeling positive, neutral, negative?
I'd say neutral of those three would be the word to describe it. I think that this class is sort of like a 6 out of 10 overall. I do think it's a little bit top heavy. The last 2 years, like even last year, I obviously loved the class. It was a great class, but even last year, there just wasn't, there weren't many obvious like go-to day 3 wide receivers to kind of get excited about, right? And I kind of feel similarly this year. Like the NFL, maybe it's getting things right a little bit more. But then I also see some round 3 guys that got drafted this year. And I'm like, wow, I expected them to go in like round 6, round 7. Yeah. And so, it was kind of weird from that perspective. But I think a lot of what we saw was it's a top heavy class, and wide receiver is always going to have some value inherently, just from a pay scale standpoint and what they bring to the table for your offense. So they're going to have some value to some degree. So that's going to raise draft capital to some, for some of these guys. And then if a team really likes Isaac Tesla, or if a team really likes Pat Bryant, then they're going to just go get their guy. And that's why we saw them have some, semi-surprising, draft capital in the draft. But overall, I don't think it's a bad wide receiver class. It's just that we're coming off of one last year that was really strong. And so we probably, we're a little bit spoiled.
Yeah. And last year's class, like I know sometimes it takes multiple years for these things to settle in, but the 2014 wide receiver class was talked about for many years as being like so good for fantasy football. But when we look at the opening like 2 rounds of, drafts now for 2025, there's quite a few of those sophomore players in there. And I think it'll be looked back very, very fondly on. And even like somebody who, didn't have a huge amount of success in Marvin Harrison Jr. last year, still has fallen down in terms of rankings, but there's still upside. People are still looking at Roma Dunze and so on. So interesting group. This year, we are led off by kind of the 2 guys that went early in the drafts, and that is Travis Hunter and Tet McMillan. They're going in the early wide receiver 20s. Were they players that you were high on coming in terms of like where you would have them tiered versus the rest of the group when you mentioned it being top heavy? Or do you think that they're in a tier where they maybe were drafted higher than they should have been by the NFL teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they went, obviously Travis Hunter is a little bit difficult to evaluate just because I don't think that he would have gone where he went in the actual NFL draft if not for his two-way ability.
Yeah.
I think that, if you could think of him more as like a maybe Garrett Wilson type prospect, which we know is more of like a 10 to 15 range kind of player, and that's probably where he would have gone. Tet McMillan to me was really, really solid. He wasn't quite Drake London from a prospecting standpoint in the stuff that I look at, but he's definitely in that ballpark. I think that he's more Cortland Sutton and maybe T. Higgins, but obviously Higgins has fallen to a really advantageous spot for his fantasy production and such. But McMillan to me, from a landing spot perspective, he slides right into a place where there's not really established what pass catchers, no guys that I'm like overly concerned about. I really like Jalen Coker as like a slot player long. Yeah. I'm a cokehead like
we're all hoping it happens, but it could be tricky. Yeah.
Let's be realistic about like what the real ceiling outcome is for a player like that. I think Adam Thielen, for 2025, can be solid and what they have is a couple slot guy on the perimeter and Xavier Legette, who I thought was overrated entering the NFL, and I didn't see anything to change my mind really as a rookie. And then, you get sort of these slot guys, and then you get Tet McMillan, who fits in seamlessly because he plays everywhere. Like he was really, really solid out of the slot at Arizona, but he can play the perimeter as well. So I think that they looked at him and said, he can be our guy who's going to move across the line of scrimmage. We can get really creative with him. I think personally that maybe it starts a little slow just because they do have some established players, but I think he's going to lead the team in targets this year, like pretty comfortably. Just given his prospect profile. Whereas obviously Travis Hunter is playing alongside Brian Thomas. There's maybe some concern about how much wide receiver he's actually going to play. I'm not as concerned just based on what Jacksonville's been saying. And not only that, when we say that, I think mostly it just comes down to, is he going to be on the field during run plays and stuff? And is he, I'm more concerned about the route share as opposed to just the snaps that he's going to play. And also when he's on the field, he's probably going to see a pretty crazy targets per out run rate just because they're going to want to get him the ball when he is, playing that position. I will say though, like from a strictly projection standpoint, I do think McMillan, I do favor McMillan over Hunter. I think he's a safer projection just given the circumstance and what's going on around him and what we saw from Bryce Young down the stretch last year. But like the rookies, like the rookie running backs, I think these wide receivers, like it's really hard to say, yeah, you got to fade them because we know that rookie wideouts are just really, really good bets in redraft.
Yeah, and that was the other thing, again, about the price, and I'm going to keep coming back to this offseason, but again, those rookies, even if they're drafted with high capital, might have been 6th, 7th round, again, a couple of seasons ago, but now they're going multiple rounds earlier. On the part of, the Travis Hunter, he is obviously going to fit into that part where you're like, well, he can't make his way to be the wide receiver one on the team. But the part that it really strikes home there is the targets per route run. I expect that he won't be out there all the time, but when he's out there, he's going to there'll be packages that they're going to try and get him involved in. But there's a positive to that, and the fact that if he's out there, they're going to try and get him involved. The other part, though, is that he's not going to be used all the time in them ways that I think McMillan could be. The part with him, as you mentioned, about like can be used in multiple ways and the team can move him around. What we're really seeing with the wide receivers that have the potential in the first round of drafts here, the like of Malik Neighbors coming in last year, CeeDee Lamb, Jamar Chase, they're used on like multiple routes, multiple ways, get them like short receptions, like basically just like giving them a floor and buffering it up. And if he leads the team in targets and is getting some of those like short passes, even if it's only a catch for 5 yards, it's 1.5 points every time he does that. Yeah. That was one of the areas where like Neighbors and Chase last year, along with Lamb, were really starting to, elevate themselves away from some of the other guys, was how the team was like just giving them these basically handoffs that were giving them easy additional points. And I feel like there's more of a path for McMillan to do that in this offense, because that would also help take Bryce Young along and help him to continue to develop. So I think you have probably Adam Thielen there, who's the established veteran, who I think has to be credited quite some amount for getting, this Bryce Young thing back on track. And I think that he'll be there, but it really is a case of there's multiple kind of role players there. And if he can establish himself as the kind of the guy, I think it's pretty exciting at his ADP to try and add him into rosters. I think it's a little bit harder to put Travis Hunter in there, even though you'll want to sprinkle him in, just because they're basically the same cost. And I think if I'm on the clock and I have the option of the two of them, I think I'm going to lean to McMillan the majority of the time there. When we get into the wide receiver 50 range, we have Burden, Jayden Higgins, Emeka Egbuka, and Trey Harris. Those guys, kind of similar thing. How are you feeling about those? I guess I did it with the running backs, but ranking those guys kind of in terms of talent pre-NFL draft before we know the landing spot.
Yeah, so pre-NFL draft, my model loved and still loves Luther Burden. It cares more about peaks than valleys. As I always kind of describe it, where Luther Burden's sophomore season was probably, from a production standpoint, the best season of any wide receiver in this class when you age adjust. And so I obviously his deployment was very like Wan'Dale Robinson-esque in the way that they deployed him, but from a production standpoint, it was unbelievable. How, especially when you adjust what he was doing with breakout score, which looks at receiving yards per team pass attempt, adjust for age, adjust for strength of opponent, and him playing in the SEC, that adjusted that favorably. His sophomore season, his end season receiving yards per team pass attempt when adjusted for strength of opponent was 3.37, which is just wild for a sophomore. And so Burden was looked at really favorably. I think that the model looked at him as more of a ceiling outcome, but really liked him as a prospect still. Jayden Higgins was solid. Obviously he can move really well for his size. But I don't know if he profiled necessarily as an obvious alpha. And which is good that he fell to Houston, where he's not going to be asked to be that alpha.
Yeah.
Matt Harmon with reception perception saw him more as a power slot, similar to how he saw Keon Coleman last year. And I think that landing spot helps with that a little bit. I love Emeka Egbuka. He ranked ahead of post-draft. He ranked ahead in the prospect model of Luther Burden. Pre-draft, Burden looked a little bit better. But Egbuka is just a really, really solid prospect. A lot of people think that he's only a slot. I think he can play inside and out. He was still top 5 in this class in yards per route run from the perimeter. And he obviously is coming from a spot at Ohio State where we've just seen wide receiver after wide receiver do fairly well and perform well. So I do like Egbuka as a talent. And then Trey Harris, later career production from Harris, obviously had the crazy, honestly, you can make the argument that his final season was the second best individual season from a wide receiver in this class, just because of how crazy he was per route run. But, landing spot wise, he falls to a spot in LA where he can seamlessly step in and kind of be the outside guy to Ladd McConkey's, kind of going inside out, mostly playing on the inside. And I think the pairing makes a lot of sense for Harris with McConkey. So all these guys have some positive traits, whether it's landing spot or prospect profile driven. And then there is some negative though to them too.
Yeah. So then they're definitely, and that's why they're obviously not going in the same range as Ted McMillan, but there's obviously positives that you've mentioned, but there's the challenges then for like Egbuka and Burden in particular with the kind of crowded landscape in front of them. Even with that in mind, do you still see paths to them? We're looking at these running backs in the show earlier this week. We're saying this is the depth chart. This is how they climb it. I think there is ways that Burden pushes himself right up there pretty quickly. With Egbuka, obviously Mike Evans, you have Chris Godwin coming back from the injury, and then you have McMillan there who had a really strong run at the end of last season. Do you see him being able to fight his way in this year to be like a key focus of that offense, or do you feel like he almost at the moment's feeling a little bit like a 2026 is when you're going to be really excited about him? Because I can see the veterans kind of fade out. The one part of this whole move to get Egbuka on the roster that makes it a little, I'm like, why didn't you just let Chris Godwin walk in free agency? That would have made this all make it a lot more smooth. And then he would be going 4 rounds earlier than he currently is.
Yeah, exactly. I think that with Burden, I agree. There's definitely an out for him to see a higher target share because he's going to be playing the slot in a Ben Johnson offense. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown, but I think Johnson is going to be able to scheme open a guy like Burden really easily and give
those
Caleb
free
Williams
touches that I was talking about with the other wide receivers, like getting him the ball where he's getting easy completions.
Yeah, because that's the kind of player he is. He's probably the best yak player, wide receiver in this class, and he's gonna be able to scheme him open and give. Here's the other thing too: is Caleb Williams needs those easy outs to develop, right?
He does,
and that is exactly what a guy like Burden can do for Williams. So I think that there's a chance that Burden sees a higher target share than what he's going to naturally be projected. And then obviously there's going to be contingent upside of multiple wide receivers getting, if DJ Moore or Rome Odunze get hurt, then all of a sudden, Burden gets elevated even more. So there's that contingent upside for him too. With Egbuka, Tampa Bay is also a weird spot because last year they draft Jalen McMillan, who was a slot player at Washington. And then he plays on the perimeter for Tampa Bay last year. And then they go and they get Egbuka, who a lot of people assumed would be a slot player. And now they have Chris Godwin that they re-signed. Godwin's almost definitely going to be in the slot, when he's healthy and ready to play. He's almost definitely going to be playing in the slot. He's aged now, and he played that role last year, and he played really well in that role last year. And he's coming off that injury, so you probably want to throw him there anyway. But if Godwin's playing the slot, that means Egbuka is probably going to be a perimeter for them in 11 personnel. He's probably going to push Jalen McMillan out. And it's just a weird fit from that perspective. If they kind of have 3 slot guys alongside Mike Evans as opposed to having better complements. But again, I'm going to go back to, I actually think Egbuka from a prospecting standpoint can play both inside out and can be like a legit wide receiver in the NFL, similar to the path that we've seen with Jackson Smith and Jigba, where, he started, in the slot with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. And then as you noted, the following year is when things really broke for him. The thing is with JSN though, his rookie year, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett missed a combined 1 game. Right. Yeah. And so with Egbuka, we might be able to see, this is why him and Burden to a degree are probably going, and I hate to use this as an out, but are probably better in best ball type picks where they're going to have some spiked weeks we're not going to know when those spiked weeks happen to be able to confidently put them in a lineup with 3 wide receivers and a flex. And so we're not going to be able to capture that production from those players. Instead, our best ball lineup can just do that for us, right? And then there's those outs of, injury. Like if Chris Godwin weren't there, if he were hurt, or if Mike Evans gets hurt, Emeka Egbuka, if we were to assume that those guys were not even on the team this year, like you said, he'd be probably a top 30 wide receiver in redraft right now, right?
That's what makes them so interesting is like you're looking at Mike Evans, who has had some hamstring injuries, from time to time, and they're both obviously getting older. That's how, life works. You get older as you move forward. So you've one coming off a very serious injury. You have another coming off, a year where he had 1,000 yards was heavily manufactured at the end of it.
Right.
I do think, like, I've been kind of saying for a couple of years that Mike Evans will eventually slow down. It hasn't fully ever slowed down, but there is going to be a point here where you're like, oh my goodness, you know, the game is done here. And I think the team is kind of almost planning for that eventuality, and they're doing it smartly by drafting, these last 2 years at the wide receiver position. But I could see a situation where we get to week 6 or week 7 and either of those starters isn't healthy, or they just don't look right. Like Godwin coming back up his injury, and then Egbuka is a major player the rest of the way. And that's where I think when you get to redraft drafts and, the best ball situation, obviously you're taking them and you're not doing anything, but you'll want to have him as like your wide receiver 5 on your roster when it gets to that point of the season. And then when you get, again, the other part of drafting these rookies, if it was a redraft situation or best ball, you're wondering, why would I draft him with Godwin or Evans? When you get to like week 12, week 13, week 14, and these guys are then starting to go like boom, 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 that's how your team gets like supercharged at the end of the year. So I'm very intrigued by this particular tier, like Higgins too. And I think they've all, although the situation for Borden and Egbuka, as I mentioned, looks crowded, I think it's a way that they can take advantage of it. I think Higgins then being opposite to an alpha, like you mentioned, and Collins, and then you've Christian Kirk there. There's a path for him to go in. I know Jaylen Noel's there as well, but hopefully we get CJ Stroud bouncing back. When we look then beyond that, there is a couple of interesting rookie wide receivers, as I mentioned, going later. The one probably going closest to them is Golden, now with the Green Bay Packers. But when we look down through the rest of the crew, just to leave it kind of an open question for you, is there any particular later round wide receivers that are tickling your fancy?
Yeah, I'll give you 2. One of them, I'll say Kyle Williams is kind of intriguing. I mentioned breakout score, which is in my model, which is, again, receiving yards per team pass attempt adjusted for age and strength of opponent. He had a really bizarre production profile in college because he was there a little extra time. Like he spent time in college. He wasn't an early declare or anything. But his freshman season wasn't that bad in terms of receiving yards per team pass attempt. And it wasn't, but it didn't really improve. He didn't really improve upon that number throughout his time at college. But among the top 100 wide receivers in terms of draft capital since 2011, there have now been 6, or I guess now 7. There have been 6 wide receivers who had a best season adjusted, so it's adjusted for strength of schedule, receiving yards per team pass attempt below 2.2 and a breakout score above 70. So it's a really weird combination because breakout score is working off of receiving yards per team pass attempt, but that receiving yards per team pass attempt is kind of low. Like that's not a very high best season number. But if you look at the guys who fit that mold, really not terrible outcomes. You had T.Y. Hilton, Christian Kirk, Henry Ruggs was one. Obviously, that's an extenuating circumstance. T. Higgins, Alec Pierce, and Keon Coleman, which all things considered, really not horrific outcomes for that kind of production profile. And then you look at the situation, you get Drake May as an ascending talent. I do worry a little bit about how run heavy this offense might lean just because of Mike Vrabel's mentality. But Josh McDaniels has actually not been a bad fantasy coordinator historically. Yep. So I'm
a bad head coach.
right. Just a horrible head coach. From a coordinator perspective, I don't really mind him. So Kyle Williams definitely is intriguing for me to play across Stephon Diggs in that offense. And then the other one who, again, is the guy that I mentioned earlier, who was kind of a surprise that he got the draft capital he did, but it's Pat Bryant out of, going to Denver. He is another guy who had an okay enough breakout score. When I did the pre-draft version of my guide, I wrote some like decent things about Bryant. And then at the end, I was like, but you don't really need to worry about him because he's going to be like a day 3 pick, like he's going to be, and then he goes a lot higher than we expected. Now, traditionally, and I did some research on this offseason, when you look at mock draft data and mock draft capital, and you compare that to actual draft capital, when players are immense reaches, and I have defined reaches by looking at Chase Stewart's value chart to see, when there's like when a team loses, quote unquote loses a bunch of value by reaching for that player, those reaches very, very rarely work out. And it's, from an obvious, it's obvious as to why that would be the case. But even still, if there's one coach who's just going to be weird and go against the grain and, just play the guy that he prefers and likes, it's probably going to be Sean Payton. And so you get Pat Bryant going to a team that doesn't really have many established pass catchers outside of Cortland Sutton. He was already compared to, he had a best season receiving yards per team pass attempt to over 3, which is not an easy thing for guys to get to. Like I said, breakout score was top 10 in the class, not a lot of tough competition. And he's already been compared to via the media and via Sean Payton to like a Michael Thomas type within that offense, which to me is nothing. It's a nothing burger when you're talking about like legit draft capital that you're spending on that player. But when you're talking about a late round dart throw that is going for next to nothing, it's easy to just be like, yeah, sure, I'll buy into a narrative. Why not? And so given that, and given the fact that there is a decent enough profile there, I'm really not against Pat Bryant either, in the later rounds.
Yeah, I took quite a bit of Pat Bryant and dynasty drafts over the last couple of weeks. And the tricky part with it is you don't want to, like, if there was some stuff you like pre-draft and then he's like potentially overdrafted, you don't want to be in a situation where you're like double counting that and you're like, well, right, I liked him and they liked him, so let's like go more. But at his cost, I think very, very interesting. Again, the pathway. I liked what Marvin Mims done down the final weeks of last season, but there still is a way to get him involved in that being Bryant. The other part is like sometimes when like the Broncos were talking about, well, we didn't talk about him like because we didn't want other teams to draft him. It's like, but if the other teams didn't want to draft him, it's still a reach when you take him in the third round. But yeah, he was somebody when you touched on at the start, a little bit like RJ Harvey in the running back show. I was thinking, I'm just going to see like, maybe I'm off base here with liking him. And then you come back and you're like, no. So we're relying on the Broncos here to have like 2 fantasy rookie studs this year. But last year they had a rookie quarterback that we liked a lot. And he pretty much delivered, I think, by the end of the season on some of those expectations. When we get ready to close out here, the tight end position, I think there's a lot of tight ends this year that maybe didn't get talked about and are quite interesting for some of these drafts when you get into the back half of drafts. Have you any of the rookie class that you're actually excited about or want to talk about?
I mean, look, I think that we have to be realistic about, tight end production and such and what we see from rookies generally. Generally, the guys who will work out as rookies are running tons and tons of routes. So it's not so much that like rookie tight ends can't perform. It's that they just usually are not given the opportunity to run tons and tons of routes. And so, if you look at guys who would be in that position this year, Mason Taylor would be a guy who is in that position to run a lot of routes and maybe he could realistically be the number 2 target on that tier, like top 3 target on that team if things break his way. My problem is his production profile, in my opinion, was really lacking. His yards per out run rate is in a grouping that we just don't see high end tight ends come from. It's more so that he's, more in that like floor Pat Freiermuth kind of like fantasy player, right? Where it's like high end 2, low end 1, as opposed to being that like elite tight end. So I do have some concerns there. The one player, I'll just throw out the one tight end that my prospect model loved that I think got kind of an intriguing spot was Terence Ferguson.
Oh yes. George Kittle like Jr.
The one dude who tested number 1, we actually got measurables for him. And they were amazing, those measurables, really good after the catch numbers. Obviously goes to a team in LA that they're hyping him up too. There was some video that came out about like when they were drafting him, similar to the Jarquez Hunter stuff.
I just wonder sometimes, like I like to see those videos of players you like, and you don't want to double count it, but I wonder sometimes, like, is Sean McVay just very excited about every player he drafts that he says like, that's the guy I wanted?
Yeah, 100%. 100%.
It's like
I don't want people to, I don't want people to walk away from the show thinking that like that's an input into my like, my models or anything like that. But it obviously can't hurt that they seem like
negative.
Yeah, right. But yeah, like I you look at Tyler Higbee, who hasn't been able to stay healthy very consistently. This offense is one that really only has 2 go-to meaningful weapons. And it's also an offense that consistently over the last 6 years, they've ranked in the bottom 3 every single year in running back target share. So they're not, it's one where, they run a lot of 11 personnel. They don't target the running back that frequently. And so those targets, that target share has to go somewhere, and it's going to go, obviously, that's a reason why I still am into Devontae Adams this year. I still think that he's, a good pick where he's going, and obviously Puka as well. I think they're going to combine to see if they're both healthy, like a 55% target share in that offense, like realistically. But there's still a decent bit up for grabs because Jordan Whittington is a question mark, Tutu Atwell, a giant question mark. Well, maybe little question mark. And then obviously, the running backs won't see that many looks through the air. So if Tyler Higbee, I think is going to be the guy to start the season, but if Ferguson develops and he plays out to the way that the prospect model likes him, I could see a scenario where down the stretch, he's a little bit more involved.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This is what I always you say like there's certain players that you like, and it's nice when people have the same profiles. But the part of this is like we're looking at the back end of the drafts with the rookie running backs, tight ends, wide receivers. So we've talked about, and they're kind of like in that range. It's like I'm not really interested in a huge amount of the veterans. They are the guys I want to have on it. But Terence Ferguson, for example, he's a last round pick in an underdog at the moment, and he's a FFPC goes a couple of rounds deeper for a 20-team draft, but he's in the 17th round there in a tight end premium format. I think there's huge upside. I'm always looking for and this is because drafting Trey McBride a couple of seasons back, he was the guy who could make that jump to be an elite tight end. And I think there's some traits with the likes of a Ferguson that could pair into that. There's one other tight end I'll mention before we finish up, just to get your thoughts on it, and that's Harold Fannin. I don't think he has that clear path this year, but he's in a team that needs targets to go around. He's behind David Njoku. He may be a 2026 kind of player, but he was somebody in the recent dynasty drafts that I took quite a share of. Any thoughts on Fannin?
Yeah, that's a really good call out. Fannin, I actually think there's a chance that Fannin sees more work this year than people are projecting because people are going to be scared off of David Njoku, obviously. But this is a team like when Kevin Stefanski went to Cleveland, he was dubbed the 12 personnel guy. That's the kind of offense that he liked to run. And when you look at what the wide receiver room looks like in Cleveland right now, their slot is Jamari Thrash, I think, is the starter right now, at this moment. So you could see a scenario where they run a lot of 12, where Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman are playing on the outside with Njoku and Harold Fannin, and Fannin could catch a lot of those easy. He's someone who's going to be reliable, I think, in a low A dot kind of Evan Ingram type role, as opposed to a down the field kind of. He didn't have the long speed as we saw, at the combine, but David Njoku plays that. That's what David Njoku can do well, whereas Harold Fannin is more of a stronger route runner and a guy who can play more of that, possession role, if you will, from a tight end or out of the tight end spot. So don't sleep on Harold Fannin either. I think it's a really, really good call out. Obviously had a crazy production profile. There is I do have some hesitation because his athleticism profile was pretty poor, and we don't see many elite tight ends coming from that kind of profile. Yeah. But I do think situationally, it's not as bad as people think.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting that it could just sneak up. He's going in the 18th round in FFPC undrafted over at underdog. So an interesting one to watch, but I expect that those guys that we talked about at the tight end position, their value will likely stay suppressed all offseason unless Ferguson starts to get some buzz. So that was a lot of fun to run through there. JJ added in some tight end questions to finish things up. Rookie wide receivers on this edition. We did talk, as I mentioned, about the rookie running backs. Lots of interesting takeaways from JJ on that as well earlier this week. So do check that out. Subscribe to the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast feed to get those once they are available. I will give a plug here. I did a RotoViz overtime show with Sean Siegel earlier this week where we talked about Sean's blueprint for zero RB for 2025. So I think people want to check that one out as well. JJ, you are on socials at LateRoundQB. There's lateround.com covering pretty much everything that you've got going on. But anything else that you want to highlight here before we close up?
Yeah, everything on lateround.com. You get the prospect guide I'm selling, the draft guide, which is available for pre-order. That goes out July 1st. Anything else on there as well, lateround.com.
Awesome. Always fun to have a chat with JJ, and we covered a lot in those two shows. Hopefully people have enjoyed listening in. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on socials at Overtime Ireland. And until we are back, have a good one.